what does the proclamation say? What does it do? So it frees slaves, but not all the slaves. Is it necessarily states that have seceded? It's any area within the Union. So it's states that seceded and other parts that the Union has started to control some of these states that seceded. There's places that have slavery that did not break away. And the Emancipation Proclamation says only those areas that are under Confederate control, 100 days from now, slavery ends in those. But if you're under Union control, or if you're one of these border states that never broke away and you have slavery, you can keep your slaves. It doesn't matter. Does that change your impression of the Emancipation Proclamation a little bit, or what it does?
I'm taking this course, number one, because I hear a lot of names for African American leaders, but I don't know much about them besides the basics. I know Harriet Tubman, I know Martin Luther King, I know Malcolm X, but I didn't know the importance of everyone else or the role that they played. You know, you see names, but you don't really know. So I wanted to know the story behind the names.
This course is interesting to me because it plays such a big role in life today. I feel like everything that is in history impacts us today. And so in order to be a better person, I feel like you have to know your history to deal with some of the issues at hand. They might not be as drastic as they were in the past, but they still are issues. There's still things that we can better ourselves in.
I accidentally took AFN, and I took it last semester at the geography of Africa. Once I took the geography of Africa, I became so interested in the African slave trade. I became so interested in the politics of the African people that I decided to take African American politics. That's actually why I'm here. Like I'm just, it's intriguing just to understand it, to get to know. It's like I'm an African American, and all these things I never knew. I'm 31 years old, and I didn't know any of this until last semester. So it's like it's very uplifting. It makes me feel as an African American more of a stronger person. Like I've had a hold and I've had a place in history, because the only place that I knew of and thought of was we were slaves, slavery ended, and life went on. But as an African American, like knowing about Marcus Garvey, Sojourner Washington, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, all that makes me feel stronger as a person, knowing that I do have some type of history, some type of ethnic background. Before then, the only ethnic background I knew was that my family was from Memphis, Tennessee. My great great uncle was a slave, and now we all moved to New York, and that's it. Now I have a sense of value, a sense of ownership to my people, and that's why I'm taking this class.
It gives an advantage to the North, because for the first time ever, African Americans can be recognized soldiers in the Union Army. They can be recruited to fight in the Civil War. Up until now, we discussed this a little bit, as the Union was advancing south, slaves would be freed, or they'd be running away, or they'd be left on the plantations and abandoned, and the Union Army had no idea what to do. They didn't know to treat them as prisoners of war, to treat them as collateral from the war, to put them to work, to give them arms to fight. They didn't know what to do. And for the first time ever, Abraham Lincoln is saying, these newly freed people should be able to be allowed in the Army. They can serve. The second last paragraph, it's on page 310. The aim of this course, it's a belief that I have that if you want to understand the political system, you can't understand the system without understanding minority politics or the minority relationship. So this course begins with American politics and looking at the role the black community has played or certain black leaders have played. And then we expand to looking at African politics and looking at traditional African approaches and how those have influenced the independence movements of the 60s and 70s and how that influences a lot of what is continuing to happen in Africa. Then we spend some time looking at the Caribbean and looking at political movements there and how those have influenced the current day. So the goal is that by the end of the semester, students will, one, be familiar with African American, African, Afro-Caribbean, in general, black political philosophers that they may not have been aware of before, or at least now a little bit more in depth and understand what they were trying to do, and also how those directly affect what is going on today. And for most of the students in this class, how that affects their daily lives, or at least how they perceive their daily lives. But what would you do if you were told you have 100 days, if you're in rebellion, you have 100 days, or you give up your slaves?
You start training.
Or you make sure you're not on the other side of that.
You make sure you're not rebelling anymore. You give up the fight. You surrender the war. So what is Lincoln really trying to do in the Emancipation Proclamation?
Win the war.
Win the war. He's trying to end the war.
What I really learned about the Emancipation Proclamation is that growing up I always thought that it's what freed slaves, but now I know that it was just a tool used to get the Civil War to end. It was a pawn. We were used as pawns. So it's like my whole outlook on the Emancipation Proclamation was that it freed us. Like, oh, we got free, we were free, but it's not the truth. The truth is that the Emancipation Proclamation was actually a declaration of war. It was used as a scare tactic to threaten the South. It wasn't actually used for us. It wasn't for us. It was actually for the economic value and growth of the Union.
Well, I feel that African Americans during the Emancipation Proclamation, like I've learned that in the past. I've learned that they weren't really the motive behind the Emancipation Proclamation. It was more for the country. So I feel like the whole time they were being pulled upon to in different places. It's like tug war, and they really didn't matter in the sense of the big picture.
Well, when you hear the Emancipation Proclamation, to me, I think freedom. I think it's over. I think equality. And then today, I guess, finally I had a light bulb moment that wasn't the case at all. It was just something, it was another step that America took to kind of sweep the problems under the rug. Okay, it's blown up. Slavery can't happen anymore. But what are we going to do to move forward? How are we going to change it? Nothing really happened. It was a document saying, okay, there's not going to be slaves, but black people were still slaves. They were slaves in their mindset. They weren't equal. They had no rights. They were still treated as the same animals that they were treated as in slavery.
Everybody seems to have an assumption that the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln gave it, set the slaves free. It didn't. It set some slaves free, and how I want to have these students look at it, or at least realign their thinking a little bit, is that it's a political document. He was president, Lincoln was president of the country. He had a very political aim in what he was trying to do. And we've spoken about Lincoln before. We've spoken about the Douglas-Lincoln debates and how that propelled Lincoln into his national prominence as an anti-slavery figure. Yet, as leader of the country, he has to make compromises and sacrifices to do what's best. And as you saw today in class, a lot of the students, it freed the slaves. No. And they're kind of flabbergasted and bewildered, and they say, wait a second, this is different than what we thought. So we go from that and looking at the two parts of allowing African Americans to join the Union Army and what that does and some movements that spawns in the African American community. And then we look at the idea of freedom, of how these slaves are going to achieve their freedom, or in what way they'll be granted freedom, and what comes next. Lincoln has, and we've talked about this in the past, Lincoln has been openly against slavery. He's been against the spread of slavery. But he's ever really addressed the issues of inequality in anything we've read of his or anything we've spoken about of his?
No.
Think about Thomas Jefferson. Wrote the Declaration of Independence, had slaves, wasn't necessarily for slavery, but said that Africans or African Americans were inferior, that they were second class. A lot of the abolitionist movement wanted to end slavery, but what did they then want to do with freed slaves? Send them back to Africa. That idea of equality. So the 13th Amendment speaks to that still. Slavery is done. Lots of students have told me that their perceptions of Abraham Lincoln have changed drastically. Not necessarily in a negative way. They still look at him as being a great president. But they came into the class saying, oh, he's the president who freed the slaves. They leave the class saying, wait a second. He wanted to do this. He freed some of the slaves, but he truly was a great politician. He was a great president in the political sense. So a lot of times they leave the lessons thinking about that. I've had students tell me that they leave class feeling empowered and that they should go out and do something. And the majority of the students in this class are African American. And I kind of hope that that's the feeling they have after the end of the class. We're talking about black politics. And if we're talking about what has founded some of these movements and encouraged these movements, put those to use in everyday life. And eventually we start getting to the student movements, to SNCC and things like that, which really get the students to think, I do have a role to play in this. I have some sort of power to change things. And to me, that's really important, because if you're going to change something, you ought to be doing it and trying when you're young before you get caught up in being part of the system and it becomes really hard to change what you're already a part of. It would be a mark of unspeakable national depravity if neither the horrors of this war nor the dawning prospect of peace should soften the heart and dispose the American people to renounce and forsake their evil policy towards the colored race. So once again, it's an appeal to white America to say, slavery's done. It's over with. Let's move on. Let's start on an equal foot. Let's try to ignore and overlook what's happened until now, and let's start from scratch and work together.